Okay, so in this, our final episode on utilitarianism, I'm just going to discuss one of the problems that arises out of our discussion of neoclassical utilitarianism. And the problem really is the same problem that we saw in relation to Mill, and that is that there is a hidden conservatism in the theory that might not be apparent at first glance, but is problematic from a justice perspective. So the problem is, just as it was with Mill, it's the same problem with the same origin. The problem is that the position takes the status quo for granted. And we can see that if we go back to the slide that we looked at in the last episode, we can see that we began with this position X, the status quo position, and then we started our analysis from there. So we just began with the status quo. We just took the status quo for granted. And that's problematic if you think that the status quo is unjust. See, if you think the status quo is, let's say, for example, you think that there are unjust inequalities in the status quo, then you won't be happy with just beginning with the status quo and moving on from there, because you might think that that would preserve the injustice that a theory of justice is meant to be trying to remedy. So the position takes the status quo for granted, and as a result, you might think that that's unjust. And one way to bring this out, the way that it favours the status quo, is to sort of take it to an extreme and imagine a case like this one, a case in which we have two people, so say Bill Gates and a homeless person, where the Bill Gates has everything that there is in the society and the homeless person has nothing. Okay, so here we have Bill Gates is out on the possibility. We're right out on the possibility frontier here. Bill Gates has everything, B has everything, and A has nothing. Now, the thing to notice about this is that in these circumstances, the homeless person will have nothing to trade with Gates. So the homeless person has nothing that Gates wants. So there's nothing in this theory to prevent just allowing the homeless person to starve to death, because on this approach, that wouldn't be to make anybody worse off. Now, you might think that's a bit odd, because after all, the homeless person starves to death. Isn't that making the homeless person worse off? But the point is that we're focused here we're focused here on utilities, not on life, right? And it turns out that the homeless person begins with nothing and then ends with nothing, right? So you can't, via this principle, via the neoclassical economics as presented to us by Pareto, you can't, via this principle, justify redistributing Gates's wealth to the homeless person, because doing that, while it will make the homeless person better off, will make Gates worse off. Remember what the theory calls for. It calls for moves that make at least one person better off and nobody worse off, while redistributing money from Gates to the homeless person would make the homeless person better off, but it would make Gates worse off. And so that is not a Pareto superior move. Now, what you need to see here is that if interpersonal comparison is going to be impossible, then we are going to be stuck with that result, right? Because the reason that we want to take, or if we're utilitarians at any rate, the reason that we want to take from Gates and give to the homeless person is because we think overall utility will be increased that way. Yes, Gates is a little bit worse off, but utility will be increased so much for the homeless person that it'll be worthwhile doing. But notice we can make that claim only if we're capable of making an interpersonal comparison, and that's precisely what this theory doesn't allow us to do. And remember, it's not that it doesn't allow us to do it simply out of pig-headedness or stupidity, or it doesn't allow us to do it because we couldn't do it. Right, we tried to make Bentham and so on tried to make interpersonal comparisons, and they couldn't come up with a way of actually doing it. How do we compare my love of vanilla ice cream with your love of, I don't know, pineapple? I mean, how do we actually compare those things? Well, we can't, and it's precisely because we couldn't that this theory was produced. But we take this idea, the lack of interpersonal comparison, to its logical conclusion, and we end up with what seems to be unjust. Sometimes it seems that we do want to make interpersonal comparisons, and even though we can't make them scientifically, we make them nonetheless. Okay, but the argument goes, but we can, although we can't make interpersonal comparisons on a scientific basis, the kind of scientific basis that Pareto wants to make, surely we can make some kinds of interpersonal comparisons, at least sometimes. The example that's sometimes given is you imagine a wolf eating a pretty horrible example, but a wolf eating a sheep, the sheep's still alive and feeling it all, right? The sheep is feeling itself being eaten. And, do we really want to say that we can't say that the sheep is suffering more disutility than the wolf is enjoying utility? Can we really not say that even in these kinds of cases? Okay, so that's a problem with the approach. There are some, it's based on the idea that it's impossible to make interpersonal comparisons, and we saw there's good reason why you would want to construct a system that doesn't make interpersonal comparisons. The interpersonal comparisons are extremely difficult, maybe even impossible to make. But on the other hand, it seems that there are circumstances in which we really do want to make interpersonal comparisons, right? We do want to be able to save people from starving to death, for example. And you might think about what's currently happening during the coronavirus crisis around the world, where we're doing this all the time. I mean, whether we're doing it in the way that it should be done is another matter, but we are making interpersonal comparisons. We are depriving people of their freedom. We are forcing people to do things in a way that they wouldn't agree to in a genuinely free market with zero transaction costs. We're forcing these decisions, these choices on people. We're coercing people because we believe that in the long run it will maximize utility, or at least that's one of the reasons that we're doing it. Now, should we really say, along with Pareto, that there is never any scientific basis for making decisions of this kind? Okay, so just to reflect now on our study of utilitarianism as a whole, there's been a real irony in our study of it. We started off with Bentham's idea that seemed in principle to have massive redistributive consequences, right? At least potentially. Remember, there was a rider on this that Bentham introduced, but at least potentially utilitarianism had massive redistributive consequences. But in the hands of the neoclassical utilitarians, in the hands of Mill and Pareto and so on, this seems to be entirely reversed. We start with a radical theory, but we end up with a quite conservative theory. And that's curious that happened. And one might ask, what's the true spirit of utilitarianism? Is it really the radicalism of Bentham, or is it the conservatism of the new neoclassical model? Anyway, in the next episode, we're going to look at something that really is the antithesis of conservatism.